Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 36 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I always intend for each episode to stand on its own, which means I want you to be able to listen to this episode and get something out of it without having to go back and listen to all 35 previous episodes first. That said, it is part of a larger whole, and I think you'll get even more out of them if you listen to them as a series. Particularly with the next few episodes where I will continue to cover the 1989 revolutions in the Eastern Bloc countries, I'm doing my best to isolate and talk about events in the different Eastern Bloc states, but I think it's important for my listeners to realize that these events were not happening in a vacuum. What happened in Poland affected events in Hungary and East Germany, and vice versa. I'm still going to do my best to produce these episodes so they can be listened to independently, but I also want my listeners to know that if you get lost, the context is available in previous episodes. Last time, I covered the rise of the Solidarity movement in Poland, culminating in the Round Table talks and the Polish parliamentary election of 1989 that swept Solidarity into power, effectively ending over 4 decades of Communist Party rule in Poland. Today, I will discuss the revolution in Hungary, which took place simultaneous with and immediately after that in Poland. This is The End of History, Part 36. There's a quote that I've now come across multiple times in my research for this series. It's not actually about the dissolution of the Soviet Union or its communist satellite states, but rather it's a significantly older reference to the French Revolution. And yet it has been used by at least 2 authors whose books I rely on as sources for this series to explain why the communist regimes of the USSR and its European allies collapsed when they did. The quote is from Alexis de Tocqueville, an aristocratic French philosopher and historian who I'm sure many of my listeners are already familiar with. His most famous historical works examined the causes and course of the American and French revolutions. In explaining the radical turn in the French Revolution, de Tocqueville said, quote, "It is not always going from bad to worse that leads to revolution. What happens most often is that a people that puts up with the most oppressive laws without complaint, as if it did not feel them, rejects those laws violently when the burden is alleviated." End quote. As with any quote, especially when robbed of its original context, which in this case is the French Revolution, there are different ways we could interpret the wisdom of that quote. But what it boils down to, in my opinion, is that it is not necessarily the severity of the oppression against a people that leads to revolution, but rather the degree to which people believe the elimination of an oppressive system to be possible. And that, in a nutshell, explains why the next domino to fall in the Eastern Bloc after Poland was not East Germany or Romania, both of which were ruled by old-school, hardline, anti-reform communists, but rather Hungary, where, for at least the preceding couple of decades, the Communist Party had ruled with a softer touch. It is because it was not the severity of the oppression, at least in this case, that gave birth to revolutionary conditions. In 1956, the people of Hungary rose up in a spontaneous revolution against the communist government imposed by the Soviets after World War II. I covered that uprising back in episode 15, and I will not revisit it in detail here, except to say that it was crushed in a brutal but short Soviet intervention to reimpose Soviet-style communist rule. Those party members and government officials who had been complicit in or advocated for the revolution were purged. Most were imprisoned, and a handful, including the party's reformist leader, Imre Nagy, were executed. The leader, handpicked by the Soviets to succeed Nagy at the head of the Hungarian Communist Party as the de facto ruler of Hungary, was János Kadar. Kadar was an interesting choice because he was not a hardliner, but rather he was a relative moderate who had initially cooperated with Imre Nagy's revolutionary government, breaking with them only at the last minute over the issue of withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. Kadar opposed it. but it's unclear if he really opposed it on principle or if he just seized the opportunity to break with the government because he saw which way the winds were blowing. It's probably not possible to ever know his internal motivations for sure, but Kadar was nothing if not an adept and opportunistic politician. It's possible he was chosen because the Soviet General Secretary at the time, Nikita Khrushchev, saw him as a man after his own heart, a committed communist with a mind toward moderate reform, but firmly opposed to uprooting the Marxist-Leninist system. Khrushchev was a very different leader from Stalin, as I talked about at length in earlier episodes of this podcast, and the Soviets at this time had little interest in unnecessarily terrorizing the Hungarian people. Their principal goal was to ensure the loyalty of Hungary within the Communist bloc, to prevent them from drifting away from communism and closer to the West. Beyond that, they were not really concerned with micromanaging the internal affairs of the country. Also, unlike previous Hungarian communist leaders, Kadar was not one of the so-called Muscovite communists, who had spent an extended period of time living in exile in the Soviet Union. He had lived and struggled in Hungary during the years when the party was illegal and forced underground by the quasi-fascist government of Miklos Horthy and the super-fascist regime of the Arrow Cross Party that immediately followed it. During World War II, Kadar had even organized an underground partisan resistance against the fascist regime and the German occupying forces that supported them. Though this armed resistance movement never really got off the ground and was not nearly as effective, for instance, as the communist partisans of Josip Broz Tito in neighboring Yugoslavia, Kadar nonetheless did what few other Hungarians dared even attempt to do. He opposed fascism with armed force. All this gave Kadar an air of credibility in the eyes of many Hungarians. Unlike many of his colleagues among the Hungarian communists, he was not necessarily going to be seen as just another subservient Soviet puppet, even if that is exactly what he was. Immediately after assuming the leadership of Hungary, János Kadar acted swiftly and brutally to suppress the opposition and eliminate his rivals. As I mentioned, several of the leaders of the 1956 revolution were executed, including Imre Nagy, and hundreds of others were arrested and imprisoned. But Kadar did not overplay his hand. He eliminated the leaders, yes, but ordinary participants and everyday protesters were not generally punished, and almost all of those who were arrested were released in a general amnesty in 1963 or before. Kadar seems to have read his Machiavelli. He acted ruthlessly in obtaining power and ensuring that his rivals were eliminated, but thereafter he ruled with a soft hand, being careful not to engender hatred among the general population and create new enemies. From the early 1960s on, a new social contract managed the relationship between the Hungarian people and their government. Under János Kadar's leadership, as long as one outwardly professed loyalty to communism and avoided talking about the 1956 uprising, they could generally expect to be left alone to live their life. It wasn't exactly freedom of speech, but it was as close to it as people enjoyed anywhere in the Eastern Bloc during the 60s and 70s. Kadar even adopted as something of a catchphrase that he often repeated, quote, "He who is not against us is with us," end quote. And he generally adhered to that philosophy. Kadar was a true believer in Marxism-Leninism, but he was also an immensely practical man. And in addition to his relatively relaxed political philosophy, he also allowed for a much more practical, consumer-driven economic outlook than existed in the USSR and other Eastern Bloc states. While the economy was still generally planned, as it was in other communist states, the planners in Hungary geared their economic plans toward the well-being of ordinary people to a larger degree than was seen in other communist states. In practice, this meant placing more importance on consumer goods rather than focusing exclusively on heavy industry. It also meant proportionally more investment in education and healthcare. Beginning in 1966, Kadar's government introduced the new economic mechanism, which was a sort of perestroika before perestroika. This economic reform package legalized some limited forms of free enterprise. Entrepreneurs were allowed to establish cooperatives, similar to those I discussed in episode 34, that sprang up in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. A limited number of licenses to run sole proprietorships were also handed out by the state, and privately owned restaurants and shops could be found all over Budapest. The majority of the economy remained state-run, but even in the state-run institutions, managers were given freedom to select their own suppliers, and were also incentivized not just to meet production metrics of the central planners, but to exceed them and turn a profit by selling or exporting goods produced in excess of the planned metrics. Kadar had a kind of understanding with the USSR that he would defer to Soviet political leadership in Hungary's foreign affairs in exchange for a free hand to pursue these reforms in his country without Soviet interference. As a result of this relative economic decentralization and political freedom, Hungary also attracted significantly more foreign investment from Western countries than any of the other Eastern Bloc states. Hungary's economy declined in the 1980s following the general trend seen throughout the communist world at that time, but the endemic shortages seen in the USSR and other Eastern Bloc countries were not as endemic in Hungary. This is largely due to the less restrictive price controls implemented by the central planners amidst the new economic mechanism. Goods and services were divided into three categories. The price of essential goods and services, like housing, were directly controlled and set by state ministries. Then there was an intermediate category that encompassed staples like bread and butter, where the price was allowed to fluctuate according to market forces within a limited window. If the price rose too high or sunk too low, the state would step in to adjust it. And finally, goods that were determined to be luxuries, including things like cars and cigarettes, were deemed to be free. That is, the prices were determined by the market without state intervention. This limited allowance for market price fluctuations, as well as a more open trade relationship with Western capitalist countries, spared Hungarians some of the severe shortages suffered in the USSR during the 1980s. All of these factors together gave Hungary the highest individual standard of living in the communist world, earning it the nickname the happiest barracks of the Eastern Bloc. The system itself became known as Kadarism, but was often colloquially referred to as goulash communism. Communist reformers in the Soviet Union and elsewhere looked to Hungary as an example of how they could successfully reform socialism without abandoning the Marxist-Leninist ideology or sacrificing one-party control. Mikhail Gorbachev, in particular, was greatly inspired by János Kadar's rule in Hungary, and in many ways consciously modeled his own reforms in the Soviet Union after those that had appeared successful in Hungary. Appearances, however, can be deceiving. Though Hungary had a larger legal private sector than other socialist countries, the primary industries were still owned by the state and struggled to meet consumer demands. The limited allowance for private enterprise meant that, just as in the USSR and the rest of the Eastern Bloc, most people were forced to rely, at least to some degree, on the black market. One estimate purports that in 1980, nearly two-thirds of services were provided by artisans and tradesmen who were moonlighting on the black market, rather than through official channels. Unlike in other socialist countries, the government in Hungary not only looked the other way, but tacitly encouraged participation in the black market. But this left ordinary Hungarians in a situation where, in order to maintain a basic standard of living, they were forced to work long hours moonlighting, in addition to spending days working their official jobs, leaving all but the most privileged with very high levels of stress and very little leisure time. This so-called happiest barracks in the Eastern Bloc actually had the highest suicide rate in Europe in the early 1980s. And the economic model really didn't work as well as some outside observers thought. While Hungarians were spared some of the shortages suffered by other socialist countries, they also shared in many of the same hardships: lack of housing, substandard infrastructure, and an inability for wages to keep up with rapid inflation. Hungary was forced to deal with these problems in the same way other socialist states at the time did, borrowing massive amounts of money, which further drove up inflation. In 1980, Hungary had the highest per capita debt in Europe. Hungarian-American historian Victor Sebastian stated the problem succinctly, writing, quote, Hungary had the constraints of communism without the benefits of capitalism. End quote. Of course, it wasn't just in the structure of its economy that János Kadar's Hungary differed from the rest of the Eastern Bloc, but in its politics as well. His relaxed attitude towards dissent was not just aimed at the general public, but the internal workings of the Communist Party as well. So while Hungary remained firmly a one-party state where no official opposition parties were allowed, in contrast to most communist countries, there was a great deal of ideological diversity and vibrant debate within the Communist Party. This tolerance for differing views allowed a sort of opposition faction to form within the Communist Party. There certainly were forces outside the party that were opposed to the regime, but unlike in Poland, for instance, the primary opposition to the status quo in Hungary came not from grassroots organizations outside the party, but from inside the institutions of the Communist Party leadership. By the early 1980s, a significant minority faction in the party had emerged in opposition to Kadar's status quo. For the most part, this opposition faction wasn't too different from reformers like Gorbachev, who emerged within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The primary difference is that in the Soviet Union, at least until Gorbachev's election as General Secretary in 1985, the reformers had to play their cards a little closer to the chest, hiding the true extent of the reforms they wanted to enact. In Hungary, because of the open debate within the party encouraged by Kadar, these reformers could be a little more open a little earlier. Another key difference between the reform faction in Hungary and that of the Soviet Union was that rather than being entirely motivated by a desire to preserve socialism by reforming it, there were some who consciously sought to undermine and destroy socialism from within, something that, despite conspiracy theories by online leftists, just wasn't really present within the Soviet Communist Party. One of those Hungarian communists who sought to undermine and destroy Soviet-style socialism in Hungary was Miklos Nemeth, a man who is about to take center stage in this story. Nemeth's commitment to the ideology of the party to which he belonged was, from the very beginning, somewhat suspect. He was hardly unique in being a party member who lacked true devotion to Marxist-Leninist ideology. Lots of people joined the party for careerist reasons. Some of my longtime listeners may recall that back in episode 20, I expressed my own doubts about the ideological commitment of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev to the party's ideology, at least early in his career. The reality was that for any ambitious young person growing up in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, membership in the party was a prerequisite for any meaningful career advancement. What was different about Nemeth was his desire to use his position in the party to effect change in his country. Most of the non-ideological communists who joined the party did so to benefit from the privileges that party membership bestowed within the existing system, so few were interested in doing anything to undermine the system that so benefited them. An economist by profession, Nemeth graduated from Karl Marx University of Economics, today known as the Corvinus University of Budapest, in 1971. While a student, he had studied under Kalman Szabo, Hungary's leading reform economist and one of the architects of Hungary's new economic mechanism. After spending a few years as a lecturer and university professor, Nemeth's scholarship earned him an opportunity to pursue postgraduate studies at Harvard in the United States, which he did from 1975 to 1976. Though he was later accused by his political opponents of becoming a CIA asset during this time, there's little evidence to support that. It is clear, however, that Nemeth's time in the United States left an indelible impact on his worldview. As a student in Hungary's relatively open academic society, he had of course been exposed to and studied traditional liberal economic theory, even if he only did so from a Marxist perspective. But in the United States, he not only more deeply analyzed that theory from different perspectives, but had an opportunity to see it in practice. He returned to Hungary in 1976, determined to use his position in the party to radically reform his country. Years later, when reflecting on what he hoped to accomplish and why, Nemeth told an interviewer, quote, "I knew that under the one-party system there was no way to make life better, to make the reforms work. If you wanted to achieve basic reforms, you had to make major changes, not just in the economy, but politically as well. It meant overthrowing the communist system." End quote. Over the next several years, Nemeth played politics, advancing himself to higher and higher positions within the party, until in 1986 he became the government's chief economic advisor, and in 1988 was elevated to the Politburo. From that position in 1988, the opportunity finally arose to make the kind of meaningful change Nemeth wanted. The opportunity presented itself in the form of conflict with one of Hungary's traditional rivals, Romania. The rivalry between Hungary and Romania stretched back centuries, having mostly to do with disputes over the region of Transylvania. The region was home to a mixed population of Hungarians and Romanians, as well as a few other ethnic minorities. For centuries, Transylvania had been under Hungarian rule. However, in the First World War, Hungary, then part of the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, had sided with Germany and the Central Powers. Romania, on the other hand, joined the Allies, and in the aftermath of World War I, Transylvania was ceded to Romania. There was hardly a person in Hungary that did not have relatives in Transylvania among Romania's Hungarian minority, and over the decades, actual and perceived persecution of this minority by Romanian authorities was a source of ongoing tension between Romania and Hungary. After the Second World War, when both countries came under Soviet occupation and were eventually drawn into the Eastern Bloc, their foreign policies were dominated by the Soviet Union, a state of affairs that was cemented with the ruthless crushing of the 1956 uprising in Hungary by Soviet forces. With both countries under Soviet domination, there was little opportunity for these Eastern Bloc countries to pursue conflicts between themselves. But as perestroika took hold in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union began to look more and more inward toward its own reforms, and for both economic and moral reasons, Gorbachev began to loosen the Soviet grip over Eastern and Central Europe. As he did, these old conflicts bubbled back up to the surface. Early in 1988, the hardline anti-reform dictator of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, announced plans to demolish villages across Romania and congregate their inhabitants in urban-style apartment blocks similar to those lived in by the city-dwelling workers. The idea being that this would eliminate the peasants as a separate class and turn them into a sort of rural proletariat, copying a similar strategy that had earlier been employed by Stalin in the Soviet Union. By March 1988, these plans were barely underway, but rumors swirled that Hungarian villages in Transylvania were to be singled out for particularly brutal persecution in Romania, causing thousands to flee for Hungary. This was not exactly a new problem, and there was a treaty between Hungary and Romania stretching back to the earliest days of the Warsaw Pact, mandating that Hungary would return quote-unquote illegal refugees to Romania. Hungary had never really enforced the terms of this treaty, and Transylvanian Hungarians who found their way into Hungary usually received a warm welcome and were rarely actually deported back to Romania. There had never been such a sudden and massive influx of refugees like the one seen in the spring of 1988 before, however. Within a matter of a few weeks, in March and April 1988, an estimated 25,000 refugees made their way from Romania to Hungary. Most made it safely, but a small number were killed or injured trying to cross the barriers Romania had constructed to stop them from leaving. Throughout the spring and summer, thousands turned out for demonstrations in Budapest and other large towns in Hungary in support of the Transylvanian refugees. The message of some of these demonstrations soon morphed from a demand that the government do more to help the refugees into something that was more openly anti-communist and anti-government. One man who participated in the demonstrations that summer put it like this, quote, "Of course we went because we cared about the Hungarians in Transylvania, but mostly we went because we hated the communists. These demonstrations were the only way to show it." End quote. János Kadar's ineffectiveness at dealing with both the underlying refugee crisis and the massive demonstrations that resulted led to a coalition of radical reformers and more conservative communists uniting to push him from power. The reformers saw an obvious opportunity to gain more power in the party and government by pushing out the leader and taking over important ministerships in the government. The conservatives, and I'm using conservative in the traditional sense, meaning those generally favoring the status quo rather than in the Western political sense. The conservatives who aligned with reformers to push Kadar out saw it as an opportunity to placate the masses by eliminating a symbol of the old regime while preserving its core elements under a new leader. The man selected to replace Kadar as head of the party was Karoli Grosz, who at the time was the sitting prime minister. Grosz was a relative moderate and not a very strong leader or effective politician. If we're being honest, that is probably why he was chosen. Both the conservative and reform factions that had participated in the coup hoped to place someone at the head of the party whose strings they could pull to shape policy in the way they wanted to. But it was ultimately the reform faction that came out on top in this arrangement. The reformers had accepted Grosz as head of the party, but in exchange, Grosz had to step down as prime minister, and a member of the reform faction was to be selected for that role. The man selected to take over the prime ministership was none other than the aforementioned Miklos Nemeth. In the past, with János Kadar as the leader of the party, the real power laid with the general secretary, and the prime minister was mostly a symbolic office without much real power. But now, with a relatively weak leader as general secretary, a door was opened for the new prime minister to exercise real power and influence. The conservative faction likely accepted Nemeth as the prime minister because he was a relative unknown from an academic background, and they probably thought he wouldn't be able to swim in the big kids' pool. Author Michael R. Meyer speculates that he was specifically chosen because he would make a good scapegoat for the failing economy, after which he could be replaced with someone from the conservative faction. But they all underestimated Nemeth. He actually proved to be an adept politician, skilled at turning events to his benefit and achieving his goals. Further, replacing Kadar had not had the desired effect for the conservatives of quieting the protests against the regime, which continued, with the largest taking place on June 28, 1988, more than 6 weeks after Grosz became general secretary. At the end of August, against the advice of his advisors, Grosz accepted an invitation to attend a summit with the Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu to try and solve the refugee crisis. At the conference, the normally belligerent Ceausescu, who I will talk about at length in an upcoming episode, was on his best behavior. He avoided making any firm commitments or giving any real concessions to the Hungarians, while making vague promises that the civil rights of Hungarians in Transylvania would be protected. Grosz thought at least he could take these assurances home as propaganda tools to placate the discontent among his people. But as soon as the leaders parted ways, Ceausescu stabbed him in the back, denouncing Hungary's interference in Romanian affairs and comparing Grosz to the fascist leader Horthy. What resulted was an even worse crackdown on the Hungarian minority in Transylvania, and even more refugees attempting to flee across the border. Back at home, Grosz's naivete had cost him the support of many in the party's conservative faction, and he was only able to avoid being ousted by making major concessions to Nemeth and the reformers, including lending his support to market-based reforms that would have made the most radical Gorbachev advisors blush. Central planning was more or less abolished. Traditional corporations and other capitalist business structures were allowed to form without limits on the share that could be owned by any individual. Restrictions on the size of private enterprise were ended, and foreign investors were allowed for the first time to own majority shares in Hungarian businesses. It was, for all intents and purposes, the end of the socialist economic model in Hungary. Elements of socialism remained, but I think it's fair to say that by the fall of 1988, in just a few short months, Nemeth and his reform faction had successfully leveraged the refugee crisis to bring capitalism to Hungary. And yet, one-party rule remained in place, and Hungary a member of the Warsaw Pact, firmly behind the Iron Curtain. It was at this situation that Nemeth and his reform faction would next take aim. At the beginning of March 1989, opposition parties were formally legalized, and though no election was planned, the Communist Party's reform leadership resolved to follow the contemporary example of Poland and engage with these opposition parties in roundtable talks to discuss constitutional reforms that would result in a multi-party democracy. These radical reforms confirmed the worst fears of the communist hardliners, that Grosz had been sidelined, and Nemeth and the reformers, who though they were technically part of the Communist Party, had revealed themselves to be firmly anti-communist, were in charge. From the point of view of the hardliners, the lunatics were running the asylum. Grosz seriously considered a coup and a declaration of martial law to maintain his power, but was advised against it by Wojciech Jaruzelski, the Polish communist leader, who had done something similar in the early 80s, but was by this time already in the process of negotiating with the opposition to end one-party rule in Poland. He advised Grosz first and foremost that any action he took would not be backed by Moscow. And secondly, he offered the benefit of his own experience, telling Grosz that even a successful coup would only prolong the inevitable. It was better, he advised, to resign himself to negotiating with the opposition. There would be no coup in Hungary. But just because the Hungarian communists were sidelined did not mean that the Soviet Union would stand by and watch the Iron Curtain crumble. So near the end of March 1989, Nemeth traveled to Moscow to meet with Gorbachev and gauge what the Soviet reaction would be to a full democratization and integration of Hungary with Western Europe. He started carefully, first informing Gorbachev that he intended to remove the border barriers along Hungary's border with Austria that had consistently kept Hungary behind the Iron Curtain since the 1950s. He framed this action not as one of political revolution, but rather financial austerity. He argued to Gorbachev that the barriers no longer served a useful purpose, as Hungarian citizens had been allowed to freely travel abroad for several years already. He went on to say that maintaining the barriers was costing his government millions of dollars annually, and that to revamp and make them truly effective would cost an additional $50 million, expenses he said his country could not afford. He was strongly hinting that if the Soviets wanted the barriers on the border to remain in place, they would have to pay for it themselves, something which, given the economic crisis faced by the Soviet Union at that time, he knew was a virtual impossibility. According to his own recollection, Nemeth went into the meeting prepared to concede and maintain the barrier if Gorbachev ordered him to. But somewhat to his surprise, Gorbachev agreed with him that the border barriers were an unnecessary expense and should be removed. Nemeth then pressed further, telling Gorbachev that he predicted the result of the roundtable talks would be fully free elections in Hungary and an end to Communist Party rule. He then asked with abrupt frankness, quote, "I do not know when we will have these elections, but as you have 80,000 troops stationed in our country, and bearing in mind the experience of 1956, would you repeat what you did then?" End quote. Gorbachev replied unequivocally, quote, "I don't agree with the multi-party system or with the introduction of a multi-party system in Hungary, but that is not my responsibility. That is up to you. But you can be certain that there would be no instruction or order from us to crush it." End quote. Nemeth now had a green light from Moscow to forge ahead with the destruction of communism in Hungary. In June, over the objections of Grosz and the shrinking conservative faction of the Communist Party, the 1956 revolution was officially rebranded, not as a counter-revolution, but as a national uprising, and its martyrs were rehabilitated as national heroes. On June 16, 1989, Imre Nagy, the reform communist leader who had helped to lead the 1956 revolution and been executed for it, was reburied, and a massive funeral held in his honor in Budapest, attended by 200,000 people. Roundtable talks modeled after those in Poland officially began on April 22, 1989, but didn't really get going until June. Throughout the summer, representatives from the Communist Party met with representatives from the recently legalized opposition parties, including Hungary's current Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, to hammer out a new constitutional framework for democracy in Hungary. Unlike the roundtable talks in Poland, which I covered last time, that resulted in only partially free elections, in Hungary the so-called reform communists showed little interest in holding on to power. They easily agreed to fully free elections, which were scheduled to take place in March 1990. The agreement was signed on September 28, 1989. In the remaining months before the elections, the Communist Party began the process of dismantling itself, removing its supervisors from ordinary workplaces, disbanding its militia and its secret police, and rebranding itself from the Marxist-Leninist Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party to the Social Democratic-oriented Hungarian Socialist Party. The Hungarian Socialist Party was now just one of many parties that would stand for election in a new, democratic Hungary. Meanwhile, as the roundtable talks were still ongoing, the pace of events accelerated. As the border barriers came down, the new window to the west through Austria began to attract large numbers of East Germans to Hungary, who were hoping to cross the border and make it to West Germany through Austria. In response to the Romanian refugee crisis of the previous year, Hungary had signed the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, which forbade the return of any refugee to a country where they were likely to face persecution. The idea was that this would override the decades-old bilateral agreement Hungary had made to return refugees to Romania. But now, with swaths of East Germans pouring into the country, it now, in theory at least, applied to them as well. But the destruction of the border barriers did not actually open the border between Hungary and Austria, and restrictions on foreign citizens crossing the border initially remained in place. So thousands of East Germans were making their way to Hungary, but found themselves unable to cross over to the west, but also unable or unwilling to return to East Germany. The Hungarians now had a whole new refugee crisis on their hands. Hungary's response to that crisis would reverberate far beyond the borders of Hungary, as it would set in motion the chain reaction of events that would culminate in the destruction of the most infamous symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. And that will be the subject of my next episode. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I would like to thank my patrons who support the show with monthly donations on Patreon. Your support is critical to my ability to keep producing this show, and I couldn't do it without you. If you're not a patron yet and you want to be, you can sign up to support the show and get access to exclusive history content at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. A link to the Patreon is also available on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to the show's streaming platforms, social media, and a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Next time, on The History Sphere, I will cover the series of events that began as a refugee crisis in Hungary and culminated in the destruction of the Berlin Wall. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.